if you've been coming regularly this summer, the teachers have been doing a series on the Dharma in everyday life, sort of looking at the Dharma from a more practical perspective and ways in which we can apply it in our day-to-day life. So my talk is going to be a continuation of that topic. And then in addition, Sharon some time ago started a series on working with difficult emotions. And I'm going to talk about a difficult emotion, a potentially difficult emotion tonight. So my topic is on shame and the Dharma and how the Dharma informs our response to that, what can be a very powerful emotion. And I'll make the distinction between adaptive shame or healthy shame and what we call toxic shame. And I'm going to talk, the Buddha actually talked about shame in the Pali Canon, and I'll share some of that with you. But interestingly, he didn't talk about it in the way that we often talk about it in the 21st century or even in the last century. But I want to address, as we discuss this topic, I want to talk about how our practice can help us address this aspect, this powerful emotion in our lives. And as you often hear me say, when I say practice, I don't mean just our sitting practice. I don't mean just our meditation practice. I mean the three refuges, taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, the 5 lay precepts, which we often talk about, the 4 noble truths, the totality of our practice, where the teachings really are as critical as and as important as our sitting practice. But let me begin with some definitions and some background, because I think very often, culturally anyway, we use the word shame and guilt or the concepts interchangeably, and they're really quite different. And one way I like to think about it is that we typically feel guilty when we do something or hurt someone, or the focus is on our behavior. I did something bad. And very often, if we feel guilty, we're moved to action. We're moved to corrective action. I break your lamp. I feel guilty. I go buy you a new lamp. Shame, on the other hand, is more fundamentally, I'm a bad person. I'm fundamentally bad. And rather than move us to action, it usually makes us want to go hide and dig a hole and crawl in it. Now, they can co-occur, so that's part of the confusion. We can have an experience where we feel both ashamed and guilty about our actions. But the focus is on the self and the notion of having a bad self, at least when we're talking about toxic shame. And it typically happens when we violate some sort of internal standard or an external standard to which we subscribe. And the outcome is that we end up feeling flawed and unlovable. And it creates separation. It results in breaking our connection to others. And that's why it can be such a toxic emotion, because it creates this tremendous feeling of separation and aloneness. The evolutionary psychologists tell us that shame evolved as a primary emotion, and we do believe that it's hardwired to prevent or preclude or inhibit behaviors which would have us banished from the tribe back on the savannah. The notion being that banishment was going to probably result in certain death from exposure, predators, starvation, whatever. And so we evolved to have people that didn't have shame didn't survive to keep their genes in the gene pool. People that had that tendency would inhibit behaviors that might result in banishment. And so it evolved as an important way of staying socially connected. And that continues. I mean, healthy shame serves an important function. And in a moment when I talk about how the Buddha talked about it, that's really the focus that he put on it in terms of morality and ethics. He thought it was a sort of the thing that helped us maintain our moral behavior. Mild forms of shame are things like embarrassment, feeling self-conscious, Whereas humiliation would be a stronger form. It would be the form on the outer edges where we get into the toxic realm. But healthy shame is a source of positive morality. So, for instance, it's the kind of thing that if I come to your house for dinner, I don't put my face in the plate and start shoveling food in my mouth because that would, ideally anyway, have me feel embarrassed. Maybe it wouldn't, but it should make me feel embarrassed. And it governs our behavior in that way, and it keeps us connected socially and in a group to one another. And it's the same pattern, although 21st century version of not doing things which would result in some form of banishment. But when it becomes toxic and we begin to attack ourselves for not meeting some arbitrary standard or for feeling like we're fundamentally bad, then it becomes problematic. And very often we get messages growing up that we're defective, we're made to feel that we're somehow bad to the core, though our world sort of collapses on us inwardly. And it can be severe to the point of suicide. I mean, very often it can be so toxic and so painful that it results in people taking their own lives just to escape the severe feelings of shame. We also know that it's often very central to the patterns that we see in addictive behavior. Whereas there's an attempt to self-medicate. If shame's sort of a constant hum in the background, there's a real need to try to lessen that, and very often that will involve forms of addictive behavior. So, does that make sense in terms of sort of the difference between healthy shame and toxic shame versus guilt? I wanted to make sure we sort of had those concepts roughly defined, and then we can move into sort of what the Buddha had to say about it. So the Buddha talked about two mental qualities as the underlying safeguards of morality, as protectors of both the individual and society as a whole. And there are two words in the Pali. One is ottappa, spelled O-T-T-A-P-P-A, which roughly translates as decorum. And the other word is hiri, H-I-R-I, which translates as self-respect. And the difference here is that hiri means to refrain from unwholesome actions due to one's own conscience. So there's the sort of the shame piece where it's doing something because your own conscience is going to reproach you if you engage in that behavior. Whereas ottappa is refraining from unwholesome behaviors to avoid being reproached by others. So there's more of the guilt quality, the guilt flavor there. Bhikkhu Bodhi, who's the primary translator of the Pali Canon, says that healthy shame plays an important role in our path to awakening because of the emphasis on ethics and morality and development of what I just referred to as the conscience with the hiri. Bhikkhu Bodhi, Panyawati, Venerable Panyawati, who was here recently from North Carolina and spoke, says that we need to learn to, quote, discern the difference between an experience of shame and guilt that is debilitating versus a discerned knowing that brings us into compassion and intimacy with others. So again there, I think she's talking about a matter of degree, mild forms of shame or guilt that are help us cultivate compassion and intimacy versus the more severe toxic forms, which can be debilitating, to use her words. So in his teachings to the public, the Buddha called shame a bright guardian of the world, and that it kept people from betraying the trust of others. He also called it a noble treasure, something more valuable than gold or silver, and that it would protect us from doing things that we would later regret. So again, there's the emphasis on sort of the healthy side of the continuum, if we think of shame on a continuum. But I want to talk mostly tonight about the dark side of shame, that which induces self-loathing, self-harm, and potentially can induce violence. And learning ways and discerning ways, as Panyawati calls them, to see at what point does healthy shame sort of devolve into toxic shame? When does it kind of spill over? Where's that line? And what are those internal messages that kind of cause us to cross that line into more toxic forms of shame, where we say to ourselves, I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not skinny enough, I'm not rich enough, I'm not big enough, I'm not whatever. Any of these messages that can be very toxic in terms of how we think of ourselves. And here again, we would invoke the second noble truth, where we're clinging to some artificial or arbitrary standard. And if we fail to meet that, and if we're clinging to that standard, we fail to meet it, then shame can be the result of that. And the more tightly we grasp onto it, the more toxic the shame can be. And the more high the standard, the more toxic the shame can be. And this is an experience that really goes to the core of who we are. I mean, it's that. I mean, I've had it described to me by folks that deal with it at a very toxic level as just an electrical charge that feels like it goes through their body when they have what they call a shame attack, when they feel this intense, overwhelming sense of shame. And self-hatred being the sort of the most extreme form, which again can lead to severe violence or even suicide. So the result of it is that it makes us want to hide. We don't want to be seen. We pass judgment on ourselves. We are constantly running ourselves down. We withdraw, we hide, we become voiceless. We want to avert our gaze. We don't want to connect. We don't make eye contact. These are all symptoms of toxic shame. And the fear is that we would be exposed for all our imagined defects and faults. You know, the fear of being seen. The problem with shame is the fear of being seen is the fear that you'll see all of my defects, faults, and shortcomings. It can result in some extreme behavior, one of which is seeking to gain power over others so as not to feel small and defective. We see this a lot in crimes of power, where the basis of it is shame-driven in the sense that I feel small and defective, and the antidote to that is to assert power over you in a way that is very harmful to you, but somehow makes me feel less small and defective. And see this in criminal behavior all the time. Or on the other hand, we can become people pleasers and try to gain acceptance as a way of not feeling small and defective. One of the sort of classic responses to shame in terms of defense is narcissism, where it's a defense against feeling small, defective, which are all parts of toxic shame. You see that often in politicians. This shall go unnamed. Brene Brown writes a lot about shame. Those of you that know her work, she's a clinical social worker. And she says that shame needs three things to survive. Silence. We can't talk about it so it flourishes. We don't want to share. We don't want to open up to others. Silence, secrecy. Shame thrives in darkness, she says, and self-judgment. I am bad and I'm defective. She said those are the three legs of the stool that have to do with toxic shame. So all that being said, what are the antidotes in terms of our practice? You know, what does our practice offer us in terms of an antidote to these experiences of severe toxic shame? Well, first of all is bringing mindful awareness and discernment to it, as I said, sort of seeing where does the line get crossed between the sort of healthy forms of shame and embarrassment and that which is toxic to us. And our practice can be extremely useful, and I've certainly found that to be true in my own practice. We can bring mindful self-compassion to counter toxic shame. A lot of the self-compassion work goes right to the heart of this issue. Shame thrives on being undetected, so sharing it, talking about it, being able to be more open with it with trusted others can be another useful antidote to counter it. Just identifying it, naming it, labeling it. When we catch ourselves saying things like, I'm such a failure, I'm so flawed, when we're having that sort of attack, just saying, oh, I know what this is, I recognize this, sort of what I alluded to a little bit in the meditation tonight, where we don't identify with it, we just name it, we just see it as thoughts, not necessarily the truth of who we are. Additionally, we can create spaciousness around it with our practice, with our meditation practice. Step back from it, get some distance from it. See it as not, the closer we are to it, the more identified we are to it, the harder it is going to be to kind of get out from underneath it. And so any time we can create spaciousness with our practice, we can lessen the intensity of it. And that's where putting that sacred pause in between our thoughts and accepting them as the ultimate truth, seeing them as just leaves on a stream. And again, bringing self-compassion and loving kindness to the table. Becoming mindfully aware of the triggers. What triggers these things? What kind of experiences do I have which might trigger these thoughts? Most of us have certain buttons that get pushed, which can start a series of self-deprecating or shameful thoughts. Again, our practice can help illuminate that, shine a light on that, and help us interrupt those triggers with self-empathy, empathy for ourselves. Another one is to replace that internal dialogue that supports the shame with language that we would use language toward ourselves. This is something I actually learned from Susan Stone. Language toward ourselves that we would use toward a loved one. Direct those feelings and thoughts and compassionate feelings toward ourselves that we might to someone we care about who's suffering. And then sunlight is a disinfectant for toxic shame. Again, sharing it with a trusted other, be that a family member, a friend, a therapist, whomever. So those are some of the ways we're actually going to practice in a few minutes that I think can be useful antidotes to this experience of toxic shame. So I wanted to share a short essay with you from Mary Oliver, and then we'll talk about the exercise. She says, there are stubborn stumps of shame, grief that remains unsolvable after all the years, a bag of stones that goes with one wherever one goes, and however the hour may call for dancing and for light feet. Energies of the world, better than anger, better than bitterness, and because more interesting, more alleviating. And there's the thing that one does, the needle one plies, the work. And within that work, a chance to take thoughts that are hot and formless and to place them slowly and with meticulous effort into some shapely, heat-retaining form, even as the gods or nature or the soundless wheels of time have made forms all across the soft, curved universe. That is to say, having chosen to claim my life, I have made for myself, out of work and love, a handsome life. So thank you. Liz is going to hand out some forms, which I'll explain to you in a minute, and some pens if you need one. So when you get yours, go ahead and just jot down, you can use shorthand or whatever, just 3 statements that you tell yourself or have told yourself in the past, 2 or 3 at least, sort of toxic self-statements. that you'll have there to work with as we go through the guided practice. So just take a moment once you have your sheet to do that. Okay, so close your eyes if you would, and just bring to mind one of those statements. Just think about it, sort of allow yourself to feel what it feels like. It should feel familiar if it's one that you're commonly used to saying to yourself. And the first thing we're going to do is just imagine that statement is just simply thoughts you picked up somewhere along the way, maybe from a parent, from a partner, from a friend, from your own self-judgment. And imagine it as not the truth of who you are. Again, just imagine the thoughts as leaves on a stream, as we did during the sit tonight. Just simply thoughts with which you're not identified. See if you can put some separation in there. Now bringing in that same statement or one of the other statements to mind, just thinking about it, feeling what it feels like in the body. And this time challenging it with thoughts of self-compassion and loving kindness. For instance, I'm acceptable as I am, or I'm deserving of self-compassion for my struggles, or may I be filled with loving kindness, or similar statements. That as soon as you bring this shameful thought to mind, you would immediately shift to thoughts of self-compassion and loving kindness. Just take a few minutes and work with that. Now bringing to mind one of the shameful self-statements, see if you can identify as you think about it, and think about it in retrospect, what some of the triggers are for what would cause this thought to begin to plague you. Did you feel like you failed at something? Did you feel like you didn't do something well enough? Did you feel like you got caught doing something that was shameful? See if you can identify the triggers or trigger. Now bringing to mind another one of the shameful self-statements. This time just respond to yourself as you would toward a loved one who is suffering, just with comforting or empathic thoughts, reassuring thoughts. thoughts which might disabuse you of the shameful assumption or statement that you've told yourself. Again, as an antidote to that toxic shame. And then to bring daylight that we talked about to the experience, either later tonight or tomorrow or in the next day or so. Think about sharing this experience, this exercise, what you thought and what you went through with a trusted friend or loved one, just as a way of shining some light on it. Really tends to detoxify it when we can do that. And then finally, just practice these steps on a regular basis in response to any toxic shame that you're experiencing in your life as antidotes for that. So it's really about cultivating an attitude of kindness, loving kindness, self-compassion, self-empathy is an antidote to some of the harshness with which we often respond to ourselves. Any comments, thoughts, questions about the exercise? Liz will give you the mic. Anybody want to?
Actually, I have one, if that's okay. I was talking about shame with a friend this morning, actually, and so my loving kindness practice has really helped with a lot of the toxic shame that I've experienced. But nowadays it feels almost like a knee-jerk reaction. Like when I note the shameful thoughts, I go directly to loving kindness, and it almost feels like I'm trying to get rid of the shame, which I know is what we're not supposed to do. So we were talking about that this morning and kind of trying to find out like where's that line between, because it has to be telling us something, right? There has to be some kind of reason for those thoughts. Or maybe there's not.
Are you thinking that there's some truth in it? Is that what you mean, Liz?
Well, I guess like you were saying evolutionarily, so it's trying to help me, those thoughts are trying to help me survive, I guess. Like, you know, if they were in a more reality-based kind of world. I think it just unnerves me to see that I am kind of going, I feel like I'm expressing aversion towards them to a higher degree than maybe I could be.
And I think the challenge is really just learning to let them go and incorporate some of these other techniques or methods or practices as a way of softening them. I mean, some of them may have some basis, in reality, in the sense that they are telling you something important, but the harshness is what I'm really taking issue with, because that does us no good. It just creates greater suffering. And again, thinking about shame on a continuum from the mildest form to the most toxic form, and trying to move that needle toward the milder forms. Some of it's just unnecessary mental activity that I tell myself that has no basis in self-improvement. It's just beating myself up. And learning to let that go and bring in some practices of loving kindness, compassion, self-empathy, talking to myself as I would a suffering loved one is a way of trying to just soften it and bring in greater kindness. So it's a work in progress for all of us. Thank you. Other thoughts or comments? Yes, Bill.
Thanks, Jeff, for the exercise. What I noticed when I investigated, your prompts and then compared them to the solutions you offered, is that I guess often a strategy that I've used is to bargain with that emotion. So end up having a dialogue. Oh, you're not so good. Well, actually, you're not so bad. And basically have this sort of, dialogue back and forth, which actually seemed to be, as I was coming to terms with it, I thought it was a reasonable strategy to sort of tamp it down. But in a sense, when you go right to the Buddhist concepts of both letting it go and loving kindness, there isn't anything better than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a common strategy, but I think it is limited in terms of how much it's going to ultimately bring loving kindness and self-compassion to ourselves. I mean, that's at least my bias. Thanks, Bill. Jeff.
I suppose I am struggling with too hard a word, the idea of shame. The idea of shame on a personal level, shame as a moral issue and as a descriptor, personal morality, and on a societal level, shame is expressed in ethical failure. Would that be about right? I'm trying to. Shame has always been associated with very specific things in my life.
Yes.
And the idea of shame being a inhibitor towards, or push towards better action. Maybe I don't know exactly how to say that.
Yeah,
because of shame, I'm not wrapping. That is not an active force that I recognize in those words. And I wonder if there's a simpler thing. Morality is the closest I can come.
Yeah. And it's feeling discomfort when we behave in ways that are we know to be or find to be socially unacceptable or immoral, unethical, whatever you want to call them. The physical response, the emotional response, the body response is a mild form of shame. I mean, that's just one way we can define it. It's just. I was trying to put all that on a continuum in terms of saying this is healthy and this keeps us on the straight and narrow, and this does nothing but cause us a tremendous amount of suffering on this outer limit of the continuum.
I just never looked at it from the point of view of external control and morality. I always like to think that my spiritual growth is based more on a personal desire for attainment.
And I don't think that's mutually exclusive to this concept. I mean, I think we all aspire to that. But one of the things that helps kind of govern that, I think, is this internal voice, if you will, Jiminy Cricket or whatever, let your conscience be your guide kind of thing. I hope that makes some sense.
I get stuck with Maslow.
Any other comments or questions? Julie?
Thanks. Both in my personal experience and then also my experience working with people in a mental health context who are experiencing shame, one of the things I've noticed is that quite frequently when the self-compassion can come in, what arises then is grief. And that shame is a way to block grief.
Yeah.
It's a way to kind of hold grief at bay so long as we're blaming ourselves and we're taking that in and isolating and hiding, we're not really facing the thing that hurt.
Yeah.
And so I find it can be a real doorway for moving through something in a growthful way.
Yeah.
I consider grief a growthful process.
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you. No, that's makes a lot of sense. Did everyone hear what Julie said about grief? Yeah, thank you. Okay, anything else? Well, thanks for your time and attention. We'll see you next week.